Hello, everyone, and welcome to the September issue of the Seekers Forum. It's great to be with you today. I hope you're doing well during this strange period that we find ourselves in. So today we're going to be looking at dropping the mirror of self-consciousness, this illusory sense of self that keeps us trapped in a very small identity and prevents us from awakening to our own true nature. So let's begin by defining our terms. When we talk about self-consciousness, we're pointing to the individual ego-bound personality, the body-mind that we take ourselves to be separate from other body-minds. When I say myself or yourself, that is the self that we're referring to. Whatever's contained in your given name, including biography, memories, your origin story, all of these adhere to this small identity, this small self. Now, ordinarily, we're so enculturated into believing that this is the only self there is, that the question, who am I, can seem academic or abstract. From the earliest age, we're convinced that who we are is contained in the physical body and mind, that what we see is what we get. This belief in ourselves as things begins around the first time that a child first sees herself in the mirror. That moment of self-encounter is actually tantamount to a kind of fall from grace. It's a loss of innocence that seems to separate her from the rest of the world. Not until she beholds her image in the mirror and perceives herself as an object, a thing in a world of other things, does her innocence and loss and delusion begin. Now, psychologists tell us that this objectification, seeing ourselves as objects, is a necessary step to individuation that each of us needs to go through in the development of a healthy ego. No sooner does the child perceive herself to be separate from others, though, that she goes around proving that separateness by resisting, by insisting on her way, by doing anything she can to build up this sense of self. That period that's known as the terrible twos. With each stomp of her foot, each refusal to obey, each no, the child's sense of self grows more defined and insular. She constructs a self-image that's based on her impressions, including what she's told about herself, her observations, desires, aversions, the prejudices, fears, and assumptions that correspond to this reflection in the mirror. The more individuated the child becomes, the more she loses her sense of connection to all things. Over time, she becomes obsessed, either enamored of or repelled by this reflection in the mirror. This develops over time into narcissism, which is, of course, a universal quality that all of us share, which exists on a spectrum from what's called now healthy narcissism, normal narcissism, to pathological or toxic narcissism. Now, healthy narcissism endows a person with confidence enough to stand on her own 2 feet, to value herself as an individual while remembering that she is only one of many, and that she's fundamentally connected to everything else, including the divine. Pathological narcissism, on the other hand, as suggested in the Greek myth where the youth falls in love with his reflection in the pool and is no longer able to hear the voices of people, that kind of narcissism is tragic and deadly. Today, thanks to consumerism and materialism and addiction to social media, our tendency towards self-obsession has increased exponentially, blurring the line between healthy self-regard and narcissistic self-obsession. It's important to remember that this obsession can be flattering or it can be filled with self-loathing. A lot of folks don't realize that narcissism comes in different flavors. You can be inflated or you can be deflated. You can be a so-called positive narcissist or a negative narcissist. The person who can't stop putting herself down and talking about how terrible she is, who's just obsessed with her flaws, is no less narcissistic than the person who thinks that she is just the cat's pajamas. What we label chronically low self-esteem, I'm just the worst person, nothing I do matters, I'm a waste of humanity, that kind of low self-esteem is entrapment in a self-hating mirror. But it's the same kind of obsession. It's the flip side of the grandiose narcissism that we tend to think about. Though some forms of narcissism feel better to the ego than others, they are equally delusional and false. Now, spiritually, this fall into excessive self-consciousness has a parallel in the story of Genesis. Of course, there's the story of Adam and Eve who are naked in the garden. In other words, naturally connected innocence, unself-aware, and then invited by the serpent to taste of the tree of good and evil, of opposites and duality. Even though the serpent is traditionally equated with Satan, he's actually also a symbol of wisdom and creativity, in that the serpent is constantly shedding its own skin and recreating itself. There are many, many ways of reading this story, of course. When Eve disobeys God and tastes the apple, the two are cast out of the garden into the world of opposites, of either or, good, bad, split off from their unity. She and Adam become conscious of themselves as separate entities, and this self-consciousness represents the loss of their divine awareness. Now, as an allegory of consciousness, this fall, or original sin as it's known, is the beginning of delusion and the forgetting of our own true nature. As seekers of the truth, our lives are devoted to remembering what we've forgotten and realizing that, contrary to punitive patriarchal religions that would damn us for disobedience for all of eternity, we have actually never left the garden. We've simply forgotten our connection. We've forgotten our innocence, but they were never lost. As we remember our divine identity, Plato called this process anamnesis, the enthrallment with our superficial self-image begins to fade, and it releases us from the prison of the little me. We come to see that we've spent our lives as mistaken identities, imprisoning a self that is infinitely larger into a very tight container. This self, this larger self, capital S, transcends our human form, though. It transcends the mind. It perceives the visible world, including the little me, through the wider lens of a transcendental intelligence. Sometimes called the witness, this consciousness or awareness is our greatest ally on the spiritual path. It's the power that enables us to do self-inquiry. Contrasted against the little me, the big I isn't bound by self-image. Instead of becoming a limited object, the big I is the eternal subject. It's our very essence, our guide. It's that still small voice within, without which self-knowledge and spiritual awakening would be impossible. Without the ability to be self-aware, we would wander endlessly in the mirror of reflections and appearances, trapped in the projections of the mind, and unable to extricate ourselves, to step back or see ourselves through the larger lens of the big I, through the eyes of God. Now, when I talk about God, I mean wisdom mind. It's the wisdom mind that we all possess. It's the power to observe ourselves honestly, kindly, and without excuses, to see through that constructed self-image into the vastness beyond the story. This thing in you that sees this vastness is the vastness itself. Resting in witness awareness, we perceive through the eyes of God, although we don't know it. We imagine ourselves to be just this name, this small identity that we're tethered to. Connected to this invented identity, most people die without ever having encountered the truth of themselves or recognized the God within. In my own life, that was my greatest fear, to stumble off the cliff of my own existence into oblivion without ever having met myself. I didn't want to die a stranger to myself. And this is true of many seekers. We don't want to die without meeting ourselves fully as we are and experiencing the aha, that perception of self. When the scales of the story fall away and we see our true face in the mirror, with no need to keep inventing ourselves, no need to continue bolstering ourselves or holding on to the past, which is dead and gone, that's when we become free. Imagine how that would feel, seeing yourself through the eyes of God, seeing yourself through the eyes of the divine, without pride, without prejudice. Awakened eyes that are clear of dust, clear of biography, that meet the awareness in you that doesn't die. Because that is the purpose of our existence, to reconnect to that awareness and recognize it as our very essence. That's what all spiritual practice is about. Turning our sights inward, stepping back from the mirror, paying attention to what's paying attention, and learning to embody that awareness rather than limiting our sights to the superficial, self-limiting perspective of the little me. Now, nothing could sound less appealing to the ego. Why would thinking less of myself be a good thing to do or make me feel better, the ego asks. Why would questioning the little me, this life story that I'd put so much energy into constructing and protecting and suffering for, why would that be a wise thing to do? This question is comparable to a prisoner in a cell with an open door, asking why they should leave their comfortable, familiar space. The answer is that it is in our wiring to leave the cell. It's in our wiring to desire liberation. We're born longing for freedom, and we're pulled toward the truth. The question is, how do we do this? How do we drop this mask of the tiny, limited, fear-bound biographical self and perceive the larger picture of what's moving through us, that thing that animates us and the rest of creation? How do we regain that sense of connection? I'd like to just suggest 4 practices that have helped me in my life, and all of them are very useful. Let's begin with the first, which is mirror work. I discovered this practice as a little boy in a house where there was a lot of confusion and no one to answer my questions. And I was always very inquisitive. So I'd lock myself in the bathroom and I would sit in front of the mirror and look into my own eyes and ask myself questions. Now that was the result of a lot of loneliness, but it actually brought me to an amazing realization. Because when I looked into my eyes long enough, when I steadied my awareness and I started to ask myself questions, how are you? Where does it hurt? What do you need to know? Why are you sad? Whatever it happened to be. I became very aware that the part of me that was asking the question was different than the reflection in the mirror. When we begin to ask ourselves these questions in front of the mirror and then we pause to notice what we see, an extraordinary division takes place. We see the gap between the inquiring mind, the witness consciousness, the part of us that's awake and ever alive, and this one-dimensional creature, this figure in the mirror. It's as if we can read our own faces. We receive answers that we never expected to get from that form of self-encounter. So I recommend it very highly. You'll really be amazed by how calming and clarifying this kind of self-inquiry can be. The next tool is exploratory writing, which many of you are familiar with, recording your thoughts and feelings on paper. It's a time-honored path of self-knowledge, dating back many thousands of years. Writing for self-inquiry is not the same as journaling, which is often about reporting the incidents of one's life. It's more about inquiring into who is having those experiences. When you write for self-inquiry as a spiritual practice, when you write to question the contents of your mind and to look at your feelings, to become aware of your sensory perceptions, you realize that, as with the mirror work, the one who's asking the questions on paper is not the personality that's suffering. It's not the little ego-bound personality. I'd like to suggest a couple of different lines of inquiry for writing. The first is to explore the difference between self-love and self-cherishing. This is very important. Self-love is a blessed appreciation of oneself as a part of the fabric of creation, an expression of the divine creativity. A localization of cosmic consciousness, you could say, in a human form that is inseparable from every atom of creation. Self-love appreciates our individuality without being deceived by it into believing that what we see and feel, this body, mind, personality, this self-image, is the totality of who we are. Self-love recognizes divine connection first and holds the temporary, fragile, physical self with tenderness. Self-cherishing goes the other way around. Self-cherishing starts with a little me, an ego that's holding on for dear life, defending itself against danger and the truth of its own impermanence. Self-cherishing is what narcissists do. They're absorbed in the wonder of their own reflection. It's a stressful, futile struggle to defend against what can't be denied. The partiality and the mortality of the little me that'd do just everything in its power to clutch at the exaggerated images it can conjure of itself. That's the essence of self-cherishing. So try exploring the difference between self-love and self-cherishing in your own experience and how they affect the quality of your life and your spiritual awareness. How do they change how you operate, how you see yourself, and what you're able to share with other people? And the second line of inquiry through writing is to look at the difference between negative and positive narcissism in your own personality. Where do they exist? Where do you fall on the spectrum between positive and negative self-absorption? Do you tend to pump yourself up to perform for other people, crave attention, to compete when it's not necessary? Or do you put yourself down reflexively, judge yourself, compare, envy, and hate the miserable person that you see in the mirror? It's really fascinating to note that positive and negative narcissists can be indistinguishable from the outside. The most fascinating, confident-seeming person can be a secret self-hater. And the least engaging, outgoing, or assuming person can be a secret self-idolizer in the private stadium of their own minds. Do you aggrandize yourself or do you denigrate yourself inwardly? Do you use people for your own purposes? Are you grateful for attention or do you see it as your due? What compulsive ideas run through your mind and do they leave you feeling manic or depressed or neither? These are great questions to explore in writing, and I recommend that you try it. The third practice is insight meditation. Insight meditation, which is very popular today, is a way of teasing apart this witness awareness from the confusing emotions and thoughts and sensations of the mind and physical body. It's a practice of self-witnessing, and it doesn't require you to sit in the lotus position or be an expert meditator. Absolutely not. You can meditate in any way that's comfortable for you. You can squirm if you need to squirm. You can sit for 5 minutes. You can sit for 20 minutes, as often or as infrequently as you like. What matters is that you come to meditation with an open mind and a genuine interest in discovering who you are and exploring the contents of your experience. There is no such thing as a good or a bad meditation. And the fewer expectations that you bring to your practice, the better. There are many varieties of insight meditation, lots of books for exploring them, many of which you'll find in the Seeker's Forum resource library. But one that I particularly like is called Seeking the Heart of Wisdom. It's by Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein. It's just a beautiful synthesis of the Vipassana or mindfulness practice and Western approaches to insight meditation. There are also in the Seeker's Forum archives many interviews with meditation teachers that I recommend that you listen to. Mark Coleman, Sharon Salzberg, Tara Brach. They can all help to steady your practice by learning from the masters. And the fourth practice for looking at self-consciousness and dropping that mask is to practice pantheism. Pantheism is seeing everything as a part of God, beginning with yourself. Regardless of your religious background, all bona fide spiritual traditions have at their center what's called the perennial philosophy, which is the one teaching that everything in existence is one, is non-dual. That the force that through the green fuse drives the flower also births babies and moves planets across the sky. The stuff of me is the stuff of you, and our stuff together is indistinguishable from the rest of the planet. If you look at the world through the eyes of God, then God looks back at you. You no longer see yourself as a runaway part of a gigantic puzzle, as an individual thing in a self-referential world. You're not separated in the way that you imagined that you were. You realize that, in fact, was a trick of the mind. It was what Einstein called an optical delusion of consciousness. That sense of being separate from everything else. When you drop that mirror of the small self and see how deluded you've been, how lost you've been in this mistaken identity, the divine looks back at you and you see your true face in the mirror. And once that happens, it becomes an ongoing practice of stabilizing awareness, remembering to be aware of awareness, and taking your seat in the realm of the transcendent so that you can operate more freely and creatively with less fear in the world of the relative. I'd like you now to do a little bit of writing. I'd like you to take 15 minutes now, please, to write about when you look at yourself through the eyes of God, through that witness awareness. What do you see that sometimes escapes you? When you look at yourself through the witness awareness, through the eyes of God, through the eyes of the larger I, what do you see that sometimes escapes you? We'll take 15 minutes to do that, please, and then we'll come back together as a group.